For the early church, the correlation between sharing food at the table in worship and feeding people who are hungry, it was one and the same gesture. And yet it's strange that these days very few people make a connection between what we do at communion and Eucharist and what that has to do with feeding people in the world. And that something as mundane as bread becomes this revelatory place of God is, I love it. It's just so, it's so godlike. Food, faith, and land, to me, it's one package. I can't imagine thinking about them separately. The thing that I love about the biblical narrative, if you go back to that, is the fact that it's so earthy. It's so grounded. Faith from the very beginning is grounded in land, in trees growing and fish swimming. The whole Israelite story in the wilderness and the wilderness wandering, it always takes place somewhere in a place. We romanticize the text and we make it into such a sort of spiritual reading that we forget how embodied the faith is. Jesus is the epitome of this lovely earthy story that he gets born in a barn with the main spectators not being a crowd of people, but you're guessing that they're animals looking and saying, what is going on and who's taking up my space in the barn?
Farming is not merely a matter of producing enough food for a society, but also of stewardship. Farmers are the ones that are managing the land. They have an interaction with it every day, and the way in which they manage it will directly impact the health of the natural resources of that land. If we want to live in healthy relationship with our natural ecosystems, then we need to support the people who are keeping an ongoing relationship with that land, and we need to support healthy relationships with that land. In search of the healthy communion with both other peoples and the natural world, it's very important to emphasize farming merely because that's how we as a society directly interact with our natural resource base on a day-to-day level.
There are a few places, I think, in our lives where we're more systematically alienated from that which we're at the same time close to than food and land. I think it doesn't take long to think about it until you realize that you're pretty ignorant about where it comes from, what's involved in the food we eat, the story of the food we eat. But what I'm interested in is, somehow thinking through our study of theology, English, philosophy, psychology, business, communications, what have you, exactly in the context as we're milking cows. What difference would it make to, be reading your Wittgenstein or Aquinas, to take one class I'm teaching now, as you're tilling the ground or pulling weeds, right? I think most interesting ideas are ideas for which our instinctive reaction is, that's crazy. My guess is that most people's instinctive reaction about this is, that's crazy. And I think that's precisely why we need to think more seriously about it.
We've been farming here since 1980. What is that, 30 years? That's amazing, 30 years. Wilma and I and our kids have been, and all sorts of other people have been working here, growing vegetables, herbs, fruit. And we have about 40, between 40 and 50 apple trees, and other berries and different things. The connection between faith, food, and land is like the air we breathe. It's the natural way things are. The disconnect that we talk about is artificial. It's a result of all sorts of things that have happened in our society.
When people worked the land together. There was a sense of community that happened that brought people together. And so that sense of community, I think, has that sense of it, bringing people together on the land, growing food together, that venue or possibility of making community has been lost.
Yeah, our dependency on each other and our dependency on God. I think people can, in a way, afford not to connect with God in a meaningful way, or even feel like they're dependent on God because of all these artificial things we've created, where we feel like we're in control. Whereas a connection to the land gives us a very strong sense of vulnerability. But it's, in our experience, a good vulnerability, because we know we're dependent on our Creator for all things good.
In the absence of the raindrop, in the deepening dark.
And for me, what's important is living in right relationship. That's integral in my faith. Living in right relationship with those that are close to me, living in right relationship with the land that I am caring for and working together with. And so how does that play out? Issues of justice are involved in that, caring, being respectful of people and of myself. If I look after my own body and live in right relationship with who I am as God has created me to be, then I need to care well for myself, and that involves eating good food, growing good food. If I care for the people that I'm growing food for, then I will want to do that in a way that sustains them and nurtures them and nourishes them in healthy ways. If I'm caring for the land, then I will work with the land, get to know the land and what it grows well and what it doesn't grow well, and work together with it rather than demanding something that it cannot give me.
A few summers ago, Kenton, Megan, and myself all were on different farms. Megan had headed out east to work with Terry and Monique, and Kenton and I, along with a few others, were at the Weens family shared farm. And I know that Kenton and I and others had conversations then. We were finding this to be such a life-giving and exciting activity that we thought we should do this at CMU, and it fits with CMU. There are many, many reasons to have a farm at CMU.
The way that we eat and through the way that we farm and produce our food makes an impact on creation. For me, faith is about God, and food and land have such a deep connection to that in the fact that God created all of this. Food is something that is crucial to our survival, and without a way of producing food that is respectful of what God has created, I feel like that goes against all of our faith then.
God has given the church two living words, two living books by which to live. The one being the Bible and the other being the created earth. The land is often used very harshly to create a high output, which means that we get a lot now, but in the future we won't have as much.
In terms of having a farm, connection to place is very, very important, especially of knowing where my food comes from and being able to see a lot of that process and the way that it can play into a lot of the different areas of learning that we do here and make an impact on how people think about land and how people think about our faith in land. I think another thing that a CMU farm could teach a lot of people is the value of work, the value of having joy in work and having satisfactory work.
I think this idea of a farm and of growing food and of tending the soil and of caring for whether it's creatures in terms of soil organisms or whether it's creatures in terms of chickens would provide a concrete way for students to learn by doing. In terms of curriculum as a university, I think we also ought to be thinking about this. Our International Development Studies program, for example, relies heavily on written forms of understanding and spoken forms of understanding and ways of knowing. But I think what we find when we send our students into contexts of rural development, which many of them end up in, is that they are working with people for whom the written word is not the first and foremost way of communicating. I think a CMU farm would provide our students a way of also understanding what it means to learn by doing that may support what they're learning in the classroom, not replace it, but support it.
To link it with programs in international development, in our peace and conflict transformation studies, just to have a beautiful garden on campus and have wonderful, who knows, in the future, animals walking around. So there's lots of reasons.
The prospect of a Christian liberal arts college, the students and staff running a farm, is thrilling to me because it begins to make all of these connections in a very visceral way that we've largely lost as a society. And they're hard, we can talk about them in classroom and whatnot, but to actually get dirt under our fingernails and live with the day-to-day vagaries of everything that farming is about begins to make those connections, I think, for students and staff and administration in ways that wouldn't be made otherwise. So I think it's a brilliant idea.
To go into farming with a bunch of really good ideas is great, and then you take those ideas to the land and see what works and what doesn't work, then you make changes. So it puts you into the place of the unknown.